Paper Mario, the Origami King. The flattest of Marios embarks on an adventure to beat the one thing everyone fears the most: non-flat people. And this game has some shining qualities. It's full of memorable moments, it has nearly perfected the paper aesthetic without making it feel gimmicky, the soundtrack is almost unanimously agreed upon rock solid, and it introduces an all-new approach to turn-based combat. And this combat system is what I'm going to look at. I'm going to dissect it into tons of tiny little pieces to see what makes this battle system what it is and how it works. Then, using this analysis, I'll try to think of what they could have done more using this system and why they could have done more. Then, hopefully, all of this combined will showcase one very simple trick to easily get the most out of such a system. And to explain all of this, I'm going to be using two fancy game design words: mechanics and dynamics. But let's not waste any more time and take a look at what's already here and what's so special about it. So, hit it, boys! Alright, what are we looking at? Well, first and most notably of all, this combat system looks way different from most traditional turn-based battle systems. Normally, in a game like this, the good guys are on one side while the bad guys are on the other side, and they take turns attacking each other. However, here we see Mario in the center of the battle with 4 rings around him. These rings have spaces on them, which is where the enemies are standing. One ring or line of spaces is highlighted to show what spaces are currently selected, and there are a few other elements on the screen, such as a timer, a limited amount of turns, Mario's health and his total coins. Once you start playing, you'll have to select a ring or line of spaces to move those spaces and the enemies on top of them around the board. The goal is to move the enemies into a position so they're standing close together, preferably in a line of 1x4 spaces or a square of 2x2. And the formation of enemies is important because Mario can only attack in those 1x4 and 2x2 ranges, through the use of his boots and hammer respectively. And if you manage to put the enemies in such a formation, all within the limited time and turns available to move the rings, Mario gains a boost to his attack power for that turn. While you're spinning the rings, you can also spend money to extend the timer or to let the audience help out. You can get a hint from Mario's new buddy Olivia, or you can run away if you're just deathly afraid of Goombas for some reason. And lastly, when it's your turn to attack, you can also choose to use an item to attack, or to heal if you feel the need for it. So, overall, pretty different from standard battle systems. There's one phase where you spin the rings to group the enemies, one phase where Mario gets to attack those enemies, and one where the enemies attack Mario if they are still alive. And that's basically it for the majority of the battle system. Or at least in terms of what you're doing. Something interesting to note about this system is how the game likes to sprinkle hints throughout each battle, to nudge you towards the solution. For example, in the beginning of the game, when you're just learning what to do, the game first shows you all enemies in their final position and then spins the rings so 1 or 2 enemies are out of line. This way you can already see which rings to spin to reach the solution. But pretty quickly the game drops this and makes enemies jump to a different location. So you at least know where they are eventually supposed to end up, but don't yet know which rings you need to spin. And not too much later, enemies will start on a seemingly random position, so you'll have to figure out the solution by yourself. It's a nice progression of hints that slowly becomes less handholdy the further the player gets. But the game also drops hints by having very notable groups of enemies. There are a lot of puzzles with exactly 4 Goombas or exactly 4 Koopa Troopas, etc, etc. So you sort of figure out that those enemies belong together. But there will also often be a group of 4 enemies with a little red symbol above their head, signifying that they are angry and basically more powerful. While this may not seem like much of a hint at first, you'll soon start to notice that these hints kind of extremely simplify most puzzles. Really, you could stop paying attention to the rest of the board and just put the 4 angry enemies together and the rest of the puzzle will have magically solved itself. A bit of a bummer, but not a deal breaker. And that's all. This is pretty much everything the battle system is, right? Well, yeah, but also no. That was simply what we, as the players, are seeing and doing. We see the rings, the enemies on them, the hints, and we figure out the solution, move the enemies to their spot, and attack them using the weapons, items, and attack boosts that we need to use. But it's only once we start dissecting this system when we see how it all works. But what do I mean by dissecting? I've pretty much covered everything, so what else is there to look at? Well, nothing else, but what the player sees and does is only half of what makes the system function. Let's quickly compare it to like a car. Sure, you unlock the door, open it, start the engine, drive away, shift gears, all that stuff. But the car itself translates everything you do at the driver's seat to car language. To turn the wheels of the car, all you have to do is turn the steering wheel. The car handles the mechanical side of actually rotating the wheels so the car will turn. And that's how this combat system, and pretty much every other system in interactive media, works. The player gives an input and the system processes it. Now, I'm not gonna go into the nitty-gritty technicalities of how the game reads inputs for pushing the control stick to make the selected circle spin, or how they made Mario's animation synchronized to the beat of the music. Instead, I'm going to focus on what I think this system is built of: variables. And variables are everywhere. Psst, if you don't know what a variable is, in computer terms, it's basically just a thing that holds a value, which can be a number, letters, or well, basically anything. For example, one such variable is the location of each object on the board, with an X and Y axis. Mario is just kind of in the center, so let's say he has an unchanging 0, 0, but each enemy has their own X and Y value that gets changed every time the space below them has been moved. The attack range of Mario's attacks is also just a variable, or at least a collection of values, signifying which X and Y values can be targeted with a certain weapon. One obvious variable is the attributes of each enemy, such as their hit points and attack power. Some enemies have elemental attributes that grant them more or less defense to fire and ice, a small number of enemies can become invisible, and some enemies have spikes on their back or the ability to fly, making them impossible to hit with certain weapons. All of which are just true or false variables that change the way that enemy functions within the system. And finally, the timer, the amount of times the rings can be moved, the amount of times Mario can attack, and the amount of money that Mario can spend, are just variables with numbers that influence some aspect of the combat system. So, as you can see, there are tons of individual variables that determine how the system works and which results will come from specific interactions. Move a ring, update enemy location. Did the puzzle get solved? Increase Mario's attack power. Can Mario hit this enemy with a hammer? Well, not if the enemy is flying. All of these variables feed into the system to form the player's actions, to reward the player, or to check for special conditions, each depending on the relevant rules within the system. And the small, simple rules that these variables have an effect on have a name: mechanics. Now, mechanics are admittedly a bit vague. I've never seen one single solid definition for them. But generally, mechanics are the objective, simple, or dry actions that happen within the game's system. Kind of like lines of computer code, pretty boring in and of themselves. Think of moving the rings, that's a mechanic. You select a ring and then you move it to update some location values. Very uninteresting by itself, that's not going to be enough for a whole game. But combined with other mechanics like checking for groups of enemies and increasing the value of attack power as a reward, well then these mechanics become a bit more spicy. And if these rules or mechanics have variables attached to them, it makes it so the system has changeable values that allow for variety in how the system works. In most games like this happens when enemies get more powerful later in a game. Their values for HP and attack power are just higher, but it prevents enemies from all feeling the same. So mechanics make up the bulk of how a game functions under the hood. But you can't have a game without a player, which is where our second magic game design word comes into play. Drumroll please. Dynamics! Dynamics are the interactions between the player and the game's mechanics, or in other words, the way the game is played by the player, or the player's behavior. Oh boy, that word again. And dynamics or player interactions are incredibly important for a game, since games are all about the player playing the game. Like, games weren't made to be watched, but to be played by a human. Movies were made to be watched. Of course, every game is different and requires a different kind and different level of player interaction, but bottom line, in a game it is very important how players interact with the system. Okay, back to Paper Mario. What are the dynamics of this battle system? How does the player go about solving a puzzle in this game? Well, I believe there's a certain flow to it, mostly in the ring spinning phase. First, the player sees which enemies are on the board and where. The player will think of the solution for where enemies should go. The player will figure out the order in which to move the rings. They move the enemies, and then attack them with the intended weapon. And that's pretty much it, not too complicated. Player sees puzzle, player solves puzzle, player squishes Goomba. It's broad enough to allow for many different battles and puzzles, so it can easily be reused throughout a whole game. And some puzzles have second solutions for where to put enemies, like this one that seems to require a 2x2 formation, can be solved by putting them in a 1x4 instead, creating a sort of branching path in what the player flow can look like. And I hope you can see how mechanics and dynamics are related here. At the start of a battle, the game assigns location values and special attributes to each enemy. The player sees these, thinks of the solution, and selects rings to move. The game updates the enemy locations based on what the player does, checks to see if the enemies are in their intended locations, and gives an attack boost if the solution is correct. And finally, the player then uses this attack boost when attacking the enemies to win the battle. Every battle will have different values assigned to the enemies to add variety and make the player solve different puzzles, but this process is basically just repeated for every battle in the game. And yeah, it works. Even though the process is the same, battles don't often feel the same because the enemies have different values assigned for variables like location, resistances, weaknesses, hints, all that stuff. So this process is not bad, but I believe more could have been done with this system. Much more. It's interesting how different this combat is from normal battle systems, and I think the game does something very unique by letting the player manipulate the enemies like this. But something just felt off when I played the game. Even though the game introduced new puzzles and solutions very frequently, I think it never reached its full potential. So, let's dive right into what can be done to maximize these mechanics. Alright, we now know that this battle system is just a bunch of variables and values that are being assigned to enemies and changed by the player. But there are a few variables that are very important to this system that often aren't changed at all. So, to get more out of this, and basically any other system, all you have to do is simply change some more values. For example, Mario's attack range is different per weapon. Remember, shields go in a 4-space long line while hammers hit a square of spaces. But those are really the only two attack ranges in the game. Even attacking items like flowers and tails stick to this 1x4 and 2x2 range. To get some more variety out of this system, they could have made it so there are different kinds of weapons and items with different attack ranges, so you're not working with just the 1x4 and 2x2 over and over again. Or they could have put more variety in the different attributes that weapons have. For example, hammers are used as a way to hit spiky enemies, but what if there was some sort of balloon hammer that instantly pops if it hits a spike? It works with the same attributes that are already established in the system, but distributes these values amongst a larger number of items. One value that could probably easily be changed is the starting location of each enemy. Every battle in the game has a predetermined setup and solution, down to the specific X and Y value per enemy. Seriously, just fight some enemies, doesn't matter where, leave the area, come back and fight the same enemies again, and you'll see that the puzzles are the exact same, both in the solution and in the location that enemies start in. Maybe they could have randomized the values of certain enemy starting locations, or at least the ones that only need to be moved in a straight line. Like, if an enemy only needs to be moved along the X-axis, why not assign a random X value, so it feels or at least looks like a different puzzle? And another value that seems very underutilized is visibility. Some enemies, like boos, become temporarily invisible to force the player to pay attention to their location. But the game could also hide enemy locations in different ways, like by covering the board in fog. So there's definitely ways to add more variety to solving puzzles without inherently changing the puzzles themselves. The system is still about assigning values to enemies and letting players manipulate these values. Having more differing values for stuff like the player's attack range or the visibility of enemies' locations doesn't add many or really any more mechanics, so it doesn't complicate the battle system at its core. So, by making use of a system's variables, the mechanics don't change, but the dynamics might suddenly be very different. Let's use the player's attack range as the main example of increasing dynamics, because I think it will demonstrate the maximizing of mechanics nicely, and because I think it's the biggest point where this system's dynamics could be expanded. Right now, the range of attacks can only be one of two formations, 1x4 and 2x2. If there were more different kinds of attack ranges, so the game just has a few extra kinds of weapons with different X's and Y's assigned, then the mechanic wouldn't be different at its core, since it's just reading out some X and Y values, but the developers would have had a few more possibilities for different kinds of pre-made puzzles, which is pretty neat. More puzzles, yay! But now the player also has more choices for which spaces to hit with an attack. So maybe they could go for solutions that the developers didn't even intend. So if the player suddenly has many more options, their approach to figuring out battles can become wildly different. Remember that phase flow from earlier, about how the player sees the board and notices the solution before moving the rings and attacking the enemies with the weapon they're meant to use? Well, now that there are suddenly many more possibilities in which spaces to hit, the flow could look something like this. The player sees which enemies are on the board and where. The player will think of a solution for where the enemies could go. The player will figure out an order in which to move the rings. They move the enemies and then attack them with the weapon that they themselves chose to use. Notice how this doesn't sound as strict? Now, if the player isn't forced to think in 1x4s and 2x2s, they can suddenly approach battles by thinking about different available options and can choose a solution that they themselves see fit. Which, as you might be able to tell, changes the player's dynamics. The way the player plays the game has suddenly been varied and spiced up just because a mechanic has been fed a few extra values for just one variable. Now that it's not about the solution, but about a solution, puzzles can now be solved in any number of ways. For example, remember that puzzle from earlier that was intended as a 2x2 but could also be solved as a 1x4? Well, what if there were shoes that didn't hit a vertical 1x4 but a horizontal 4x1? It is possible to put the enemies in this formation within the set amount of turns, so why not have a weapon to match? Now there's an extra possibility within this puzzle just because of one extra kind of weapon. Or how about a hammer that doesn't strike a 2x2 but instead hits spaces in a triangle shape? Also a possible formation using the same puzzle. And what if there was a Luigi hammer that hits enemies in an L shape? A third new solution that would be possible if there were more differing attack ranges. How about shoes that attack enemies in a zigzag pattern, another possible new formation? Or a pair of shoes that hits enemies in a diamond shape, you can do that too. Or shoes that go in a diagonal line, that's the 6th New possible formation if there were more kinds of weapons with different attack ranges. All within this one same puzzle, I might add. Who knows how many extra solutions can be created in all the other puzzles. And again, if the attack range is just a value in a variable, the mechanic itself stays the same, while the possible dynamics are suddenly increased by 6 or even more new possible player interactions. These extra options would then be important because each special weapon is stronger but has limited durability, so they break and become unusable after a certain amount of times used. The extra damage would be a valuable reason to not just go for the bog standard 1x4 or 2x2, but if the player puts enemies in one type of formation over and over again, they wouldn't have to think of new solutions, which is then balanced out by the fact that that specific weapon would break much quicker, and thus the player is almost forced to find different solutions on a regular basis. Or maybe the player was only able to buy 1 or 2 special weapons last time they went shopping, so they would have to find the best time to use those few weapons to make them count. You know, if money was ever an issue. But I hope this shows that the solution has been shifted from very strict and predetermined to being thought of by the player themselves using the tools at their disposal. If the player sees a puzzle and thinks to themselves, I could go for a zigzag formation and take out these enemies, but that might break that weapon and put me at a disadvantage later, the game's dynamics would revolve much more around the player's strategy than around finding the solution that the game wants the player to find. But a new question arises. Why? Why could, would, or should they need to do this? Would it have automatically made it a better game? Well, we will never know for sure, but I can't help but think of a quote from Civilization's creator Sid Meier. A game is a series of interesting or meaningful choices. In a game, you try to overcome obstacles, either by mastering the game's skills or by making choices. And the other way around, you don't get a lot of choices if you have to follow every single thing a game tells you to do. And if a game does present a bunch of choices to you, then it's often better if those choices have some meaning or weight behind them. If one option is always and objectively better and easier than the others, then you would just always choose that one option. Or if you don't know what the result of an option will be, then it's more of a guess than an actual choice you make. Compare it to chess. You have tons of options of which piece to move and where to move it to. Of course, you could just do whatever and hope for the best, but to outsmart your opponent, you'd have to think through each piece and choose which one is best to use at that moment, or which one might help you a few turns later. So yes, if there are choices in a game, and those choices have a solid meaning in the game's context, then the game itself will become more engaging to play. So did this happen in the Origami King? Well, you guessed it, no. You don't really get to choose. As I said, currently there is the solution and it's your job to find it. Enemies have an intended position of where they need to go and you need to use a weapon with that attack range to kill them, no questions asked. The most engaging choice you get to make is whether you want to attack your opponent with the strongest weapon or the even stronger strongest weapon. And choosing which weapons to buy at shops isn't very interesting either because it's almost impossible to not have enough money for the strongest ones. Or the game just hands the strongest weapons to you from some random question mark blocks. Which is why I think that if there were more weapons with different attack ranges, and if money was literally ever an issue, then this would make this game's combat more interesting. Having more choices in where to attack enemies can make finding a solution more engaging for every puzzle. And if that choice is given weight because the weapons with those different attack ranges are stronger but limited use, then it becomes more engaging to both acquire those special weapons and find uses for them in battle. The whole dynamic of the combat system could become more engaging just by slightly tweaking or adding on top of the values for attack range. And money. So there's a lot of variety that can be added to a game if 1 or 2 variables are changed, maximizing the amount of dynamics that can come from mechanics and creating a lot more interesting choices to keep the player engaged throughout the game. And while it would require some creative thinking from both the developers and the player to think of all new solutions for puzzles, it probably wouldn't be too difficult to develop since the mechanics are barely changed at their core. But what if you changed some fundamental values, reworked the way certain values are determined, or even added some more small mechanics that feed into these variables? It would be a bit more of a drastic change, but it could really spice up the dynamics of a system. And what if I were to tell you that there's already a great example of how to maximize mechanics this way? Oh hell yeah, we're talking about the boss battles! Alright, so, fighting bosses works on almost the exact same system as normal fights. You select your ring, you move it, you attack, you defend, rinse and repeat. But as you can see, these battles are immensely different from normal battles. Now the boss has taken over the center of the board, and instead of being occupied by enemies, the spaces of the board are now covered in arrows, attack spaces and other kinds of objects. What Mario has to do is move the rings, so these arrows lead him to an attack space so he can attack the boss. Just like before, there's a difference between the attack range from boots and hammers, but unlike before, you'll have to earn attack boosts or extra times to attack by placing these multipliers on your path to the boss. So yeah, even though the system is completely flipped on its head, they managed to have it take place within the same set of rules by sticking to the mechanics of selecting and moving rings. You're doing something completely different, but don't have to learn an all new system because you're already familiar with reading the board, manipulating spaces and objects, and finding the optimal place to attack from. So how is this a maximization of mechanics? Well, we've established that this combat system is a collection of a bunch of different variables like attack range, object location, turns to spin, times to attack damage, all that jazz. These variables all return for the boss battles, but in a completely different scenario. For example, the object location on the board is now important because you used the spaces on the board to manipulate Mario's location, who was just 0-0 before. And attack range returns by having boots attack the boss from above, from anywhere on the board, whereas hammers hit the sides and need to be used up close. So you are doing something different, but these same set of variables have different values. Now, of course, it's not entirely the same system. They did add new objects and rules like the arrows and forcing the player to land on a specific space to be allowed to attack at all. On top of that, chests that contain more objects, hints about boss weaknesses and special on spaces that activate even more special spaces are all new additions to this system. But these new objects still work with the same set of variables as the normal system. For example, every object still has a location value that you need to set to a specific value. That hasn't changed, and so they don't need to be treated as if they are a completely new mechanic. And something interesting to note is that these special tiles make getting a better result much more player dependent. Now that you have to land on a specific space to attack, it's entirely possible that you don't get to attack at all. So it's not as if failing the puzzle results in a quick "oh well" before you just kill everything anyway. And if you want to get an attack boost, you'll have to manually place it on your path. Or maybe you can't get an attack boost if you would rather want to activate an on space. It's not about finding the solution anymore, but a solution. You'll have to read the board and see possible options for how to attack, and maybe you'll have to sacrifice one option if it means that another option might be more beneficial in the long run. Which means that what the player is doing now includes a lot more, you guessed it, choices. Which is exactly what I would have loved to see in the regular battle system. More dynamics are formed using the same mechanics. The new dynamics of the boss battles are all about seeing what options are available on the board, weighing those options and choosing one of them, followed by thinking of a way to reach that solution and then making sure you actually reach that outcome. So yeah, the system of the boss battles is what I would have liked to see reflected in the normal battles. A set of dynamics that allows the player to choose their own outcome rather than being stuck to having to find the solution that was intended by the developers. And I think it's genius that they managed to do this within these same set of mechanics and variables of ring spinning and location values, meaning they didn't have to fundamentally change the system or have a mountain of new tutorials just to make it work. But you know, even though it's a bummer that it's not how regular battles work, I'm hoping they try to experiment a bit more with this system, so I can maybe praise the mechanics and dynamics of the combat in a future Paper Mario game. So, to conclude, what does all of this tell us? By analyzing this combat system, we can see that systems in games aren't as paper flat as they might seem. A system can consist of tons of small individual variables that are influenced by or feed values into the mechanics, and these values are manipulated by either the game or the player to create the dynamics of the system. And remember that both mechanics and dynamics are important, since mechanics determine how the actions and rules of the game work, while dynamics are all about how the game is played by the player. If the dynamics of the game let the player influence or play with more variables or values, then the game can create more dynamics without having to create or introduce more mechanics. And these extra dynamics can prevent the system from feeling stale, they can add more varying challenges to the game, or, probably more important, they allow the player to make more choices in their playstyle. But it's also important to keep in mind whether all of this should be done. Because when developers are designing a system like this, there's still a certain intention with the system. Maybe they meant for the game to be a bit easier and more approachable. Maybe they purposefully made it more difficult to appeal to the quote-unquote hardcore audience. Or maybe they made their game for a specific group that just really can't move on with their life for 20 years. For example, Doom is made to be a more hardcore game. Its personality comes from the intense situations the game forces you to be in. If that game were to let players make their own choices by allowing anyone to, let's say, just walk past everything, then all that challenge would be optional and Doom just wouldn't feel like Doom anymore. So, in a sense, the Origami King manages to focus very well by making puzzles so strict. On top of that, adding variety to the system's variables and values is nice, but not necessary if there's already a ton of variety in the system. If there are too many options or too many things to influence, the system would just seem overwhelming and people might not bother to experiment or even play anymore. And of course, thinking of and creating all the extra variety and choices and systems that could make a game better simply might take more time to develop than the development team has time for. But overall, if you ever want to know what makes a system tick, start by splitting it up into all the mechanics and variables that feed into the system, and analyze how either the game or the player can influence these values to create the dynamics. Try to understand the steps the player goes through to reach the goal and see how these steps are affected by the mechanics. Then figure out why the variables are, could or should be influenceable, all with the aim of figuring out how the player might approach them and if changes made can lead to more interesting dynamics. And then, once you manage to understand how the mechanics and dynamics fit together and know which variables can be influenced to make for a better player experience, you'll know how to make the game more interesting simply by maximizing the mechanics. Hello, welcome. You have reached the magical end of the video. Whether you actually watched the whole thing or skipped to the end, thank you regardless. Unless you really did skip to the end, that's not very cool of you, but whatever. Before I go, I want to thank anyone who helped make this video a reality in one way or another, to wrap things up nicely. First, I'd like to thank Nintendo and Intelligent Systems for making Paper Mario the Origami King, because this video wouldn't have been made had they not made this game. And yes, I'm going to thank the developers every single time, even if it seems redundant, leave me be! I would like to thank /credit/acknowledge the Breda University of Applied Sciences for providing me with the knowledge about mechanics and dynamics and helping me understand a bunch of other game design lessons. Now it might seem weird to just thank some random university, but this is actually where I'm studying game design right now. Yeah, I pretend like I know what I'm talking about. So yeah, I don't know, a quick thank you seemed in order. I would like to thank Barry Kramer from Barry is Streaming on Twitch for letting me use footage from games that I didn't have access to myself. I think it's very generous, so again, I think some thank yous are in order. And I'd like to thank my friend Achi for providing me with some more visuals for the video, such as the square. Yeah, riveting, I know. He also made the gamer picture that I shamelessly recycled. But yeah, that's all. I'm just gonna brabble about the making of the video for a bit, so you can zap away now if you want. But if you want to stick around, hey thanks, I appreciate you listening for just a bit longer. Because it was actually pretty fun working on this video. It got delayed for a long time, but I always find thinking about these topics to be very interesting, so I already find it worth it for just the process alone. Like, if you also want to make game design-y videos, my process is just, if I ever feel something unusual while playing a game, I very briefly write it down, then I play the game again and try to understand that feeling. All the while I take a ton of notes relating to that topic. I look up similar topics from other sources as a sort of research. Then I try to structure those notes into a somewhat cohesive story using sections and bullet points. After that, I turn that story into a script by just going into detail for each bullet point. I record a bunch of voiceovers and footage of the target game and other games that I mention in the script. Then I edit all of it in DaVinci Resolve and I slap it on YouTube. Just try not to get overconfident and go over your script once or twice, because there will almost always be something you might want to improve upon. But even then, don't feel forced, just try to get experience from each attempt and you'll get better eventually. Anyway, I think I'm going to end it here. This video was fun to make and I guess I won't be stopping now. I've got a ton of ideas lined up for future videos, so you might see me pop up again in another 15 years. But in the meantime, I hope you live the best life you can. Like seriously, I want you to have fun, damn it. And if you don't, I will hunt you down and beat you up with happiness. Yeah, how about that? So you better not get in my 1x4 attack range, alright? Okay, see you later, bye!